So welcome to Beer Protocol. I am
Is
James.
that our opening?
That is our opening. I'm James. I'm drinking rum and coke from a giant mug because I can.
This is Jacob. I have a very chilled Cabernet Sauvignon to enjoy. I'll
That's
just swirl that.
disappearing into your background for some reason.
It,
So weird.
the power of green screens.
Drinking bullet cash strength bourbon.
Ooh, that sounds good. Gentlemen, cheers.
Cheers.
Um,
Clink.
we promised that we were going to go through a list that we built, the Avengers. Um, so I actually built a list this morning at like 5 o'clock when I decided to wake up. And I went, Jake, here's a list. What do you think of it? And then we broke it apart into the point where it's now this,
I
which
think
is
it's playable.
it's not that it's not that much different from when I gave Jake. But Jake did make some good points, and we're gonna go through them now. So. We're going to start off with the main characters. This is an Avengers affiliation, so Captain America, She-Hulk.
Yep.
You have to have Captain America. He's gives you
Captain
the
America's a must if you're going to play Avengers. He has to be in the list, so we bring him in pretty much every scenario if we're going to play an Avengers roster. But what does he kind of bring to the table for the kind of strength of what he's good at? And Captain America is, above all else, good at not dying.
yeah.
um, both in terms of his role in the comics and his role on the skirmish field of Crisis Protocol. Cap is something you can kind of build your list around as an anchor point. He's relatively sturdy on his front side, and he's much sturdier on his injured side. But his damage output is pretty minimal. Like Cap is never going to be your star damage dealer. Like his empowered attack is only 6 damage with. So he has some useful tools, and he can bodyguard.
Hmm.
So he can use his durability to help your team out. But Cap is not dealing your damage.
He's also kind of the
So
midfield, wants to stay around a bunch of other people to give them the
yeah,
advantage. Especially with the
Cap wants
cards,
to.
he wants to be near Thor too.
Yeah. So sort of to back up a list, just going from there, we know Avengers has a really strong affiliation ability of the first superpower used by each allied character each turn. The cost is reduced by 1 to a minimum of 1.
Yep.
So it can't make it free, but it can make it cheap, which means Avengers gets to use their superpowers more often than other affiliations.
Which is
Really simple, but really strong.
which is important because one of the things that actually came up when I built the list and Jake looked over it, we actually dropped. We were debating Nebula as a good 2 point to drop in there, but Nebula doesn't have any powers that cost anything, so she didn't really benefit from the Avengers uh, affiliation bonus. So that dropped her lower on the list of people to take.
So, as we mentioned, Cap is a good foundation to start building your list around. You have to take him to
Yep.
get the leadership ability and to qualify as an Avengers affiliation. So every list starts with Cap.
Yep.
So some scenarios and setups will want you to be playing for damage. Other you might be playing for objectives. So it's kind of helpful to know what do you need for various situations. When you need to get down and fight, you need to bring damage to the table. For this roster that we built, we also included She-Hulk at 6 threat. She's the most expensive model on the roster, but she hits extremely hard. She has flexible abilities, and
Which
she
is
has a big health pool and real defenses,
yeah.
unlike Hulk.
So we actually the flexibility of She-Hulk was what we chose over actual Hulk.
Like raw damage of Hulk.
Right. The raw damage was there, but once Hulk, like really, She-Hulk is just there if, and the way I described it to Jake of why I brought She-Hulk in was somebody brings in MODOK or brings in Hulk or brings in one of the big, or they're running Thanos. Um, She-Hulk's entire thing is kill that. That's what you need to kill. Go get them. After, if Hulk was doing it, yeah, Hulk kills stuff good, but after that's done, Hulk just kind of runs around killing other things. She-Hulk actually
Granted,
has
you
some
kill
other
everything.
yeah, She-Hulk has some other abilities that makes her viable to the rest of the team's synergy. So that's why we chose her over normal Hulk.
In addition to backing it up, because of the variable threat level of each game, you're going to be playing games where the total threat you have to spend ranges from 14 to 20. You may not be able to afford taking She-Hulk at 6 threat in each game.
Yeah.
So for sort of like our core stable of sort of damage dealers based on what threat level you do have available, we also have Wolverine and Thor, who are both very good at running up to someone and hitting them in the head.
Now,
Both characters have a charge-like ability to give
Mhm.
them mobility, which is reduced, whose cost is reduced because of the Avengers affiliation ability. We specifically chose not to build a common Avengers archetype called "Oh God, why is Hulk throwing Thor?" or "Big Dick Thor," or as it's been affectionately known. We could have with just the inclusion of a single tactic card, but that's a fairly known gameplay strategy at this point, so we didn't want to necessarily hyper focus in on competitiveness.
also, it's if you're always doing that first turn, people know the counters to it. So yes, it's a good tactic. It's a good way of playing the game. But we just chose we're trying not to do the standard. Now we did do Thor. We actually took his the card Thunderwave for a tactic card because if Cap is there and Thor is there, you should bring it. And then like also because most of the time you're not going to have Wolverine and Thor unless you're going full killy route. Um, we brought Wolverine in there to be kind of like the replacement of Thor's too expensive, but we still need something to kill some stuff. So Wolverine kind of went from that 5 point to the 4 point slot to
It
give us
gives us a
a
lot
little
of
wiggle room.
it gives us flexibility. So if depending on the overall threat level, we can choose whether we want to get like the McDonald's fast food menu. We can have our big ultra mega gulp of She-Hulk, our regular size Thor, or our small diet conscious Wolverine. Granted, even Wolverine is a 4 point model, which is on the high end of cost, but they're all very good offensive powerhouses. They're in affiliation, and they all have some unique tricks we can pull with them. So it doesn't feel like we're just carbon copying or replacing or downgrading from each one.
Yeah, and most of these things have like most of the people that we've brought in, we made sure that like Thor has throws. I'm not sure. God, I don't remember if Wolverine has a throw.
Wolverine does not have a throw.
So
Wolverine just has violence.
So Wolverine does not throw. So a lot of things we're trying to have is we focus on a couple of things of like, okay, yes, there's a bunch of throws in this list. There is a bunch of objective grabbing, objective shenanigans. Now, in our core that we were primarily going to bring every single time, we do have two characters that are always going to come together: Hawkeye and Agent Widow.
So Hawkeye is a really solid piece, and why we think we'd bring him in most lists because he is a long-range damage combatant. He has fairly good damage output, with his only attack being 5 dice, but he also has status conditions that he can apply as well. He has the flexibility of making his attacks physical or energy, so he's not locked into a certain damage type. Um, and that gives him a solid amount of ranged output. He also has mobility options to keep him moving. He can ignore line of sight when he needs to, if they're trying to embed behind cover. And in the case where it may or may not come up, he also has a surprisingly potentially hard hitting counterattack.
Mm-hmm.
So he's a solid package that gives a lot of utility and lets us have a dedicated long range combat.
Now,
Agent Widow.
yeah, with Agent Widow, we have a kind of focusing on the interrogation. We have a lot of scenarios that we have taken that has he wants to clump people up on the secures. So with that and a lot of hard hitting characters like Hawkeye, we wanted to have Agent Widow as opposed to Black Widow to get the interrogation, get the area effect. Not all the time, but if she's sitting on like gamma wave, you know everyone's going to be clumped up in the middle. Her area effect is really good. Uh, she's also got, I think she's got the stealth portion of that.
Yep, she has stealth where if she winds up with an objective token, she might be able to get away and hang on to it
Mhm.
for us.
And with the two of them there, we also took professionals as a tactic card, which is basically Hawkeye can shoot somebody with an objective. They drop the objective to give to Agent Widow.
Yep.
So it's really powerful for like a couple of the extracts that we have, especially uh, the formula found and the worthy the hammer scenario. Uh, that card and those two together make them a kind of a good combination.
Yep. So we thought that combination of being able to play to the objectives simultaneously with having a solid damage output, both of which are important in every game, regardless of what the particular scenario or your team composition is, made Captain America, Agent Widow, and Hawkeye a solid basis to kind of split from there to see where we needed to go. That costs 10 threat, which kind of gives us a solid starting point for building lists that tackle various threat levels. Granted, you've got fairly okay defenses, flexibility for the scenario, as well as ranged pressure. You're still lacking melee damage at that point, so we have a variety of options, like we've already said, ranging from Wolverine to Thor to She-Hulk, based on how many points you have to bring that melee presence. And Cap is no slouch either. It's just he's not going to be necessarily knocking people out in a single blow like She-Hulk will on a good day.
So when beginning to think about how to build a list, especially with an affiliation in mind, is the correct approach or a valid approach to do what you guys just did is to figure out what you want your three core to be for half your list?
I mean, sometimes it's not three.
Depends.
But I mean, for the list I build, I kind of know that I want to have these set characters are always kind of what I've always want to bring, because they work well in the extraction and the secure scenarios. And then I kind of look at the board because you choose the scenarios first, and then you build your list off of your 10. So I can look at the board and go, yeah, there's not a lot of like there's huge terrain I can't throw very much. There's maybe too little terrain, or Wakanda herbs. I'm not probably going to run Wakanda herbs. I'm probably going to go for the other scenario. So I go, okay, these are kind of like my core characters I'm always going to bring. I know how they play, I know how they interact with each other, and then I kind of like slot in things to make that list fit the scenarios.
Okay, so you go for more of the Captain America is the affiliation. If you can build towards that, you have your one type of pressure that you know you want no matter what, and then you have your objective runner, so that way anything else you slot can be geared specifically towards the mission.
And that's not a bad way to think about it. Now, this is so for the purpose of this episode, we're talking specifically about how we roster.
Yes.
For like an actual tournament, you could bring a Avengers and Wakanda roster where you use your 10-person slots to build two completely different teams that have little to nothing in common.
Technically, with this list, we can also do an A-Force. It'd be a small number of A-Force, but
it'd be a small.
It would still run A-Force.
So we're not necessarily saying this build lists. We're just going in with the assumption that no matter what list we're playing for a given game, it's going to be Avengers.
Right.
So it's got to include Cap. It's going to have some similar elements just based on what pieces do we like playing and what pieces do we think work well together.
Yeah, I know. I'm just trying to get the general consensus on top of the extra layer that we added to it.
Yeah.
There's very little general consensus.
So let's talk about the other person that is actually the affiliated person, which is Ant-Man, which actually
or a Wasp.
Or a Wasp.
So we really like what Wasp and or Ant-Man can do in terms of mobility on the battlefield with their change shape, and especially with Ant-Man's hitch or ride ability, where he can move. He can basically place himself within range 3. It gives them a lot of mobility. Ant-Man is actually not a slouch when it comes to damage. He has to get extremely close to the enemy, but he has a 6 dice basic attack on a 3 threat model, which is dice is dice. It's not always going to go your way, but that's potentially a really big upswing. Ant-Man also has the ability to pop in and out and sort of weave around your opponent. The Avengers affiliation ability gives both Ant-Man and Wasp a cost reduction on their first size change in a given turn, which gives them a lot of flexibility for where they're standing. It lets them also use their PIM particles to dodge enemy attacks.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, hang on a second. No, it doesn't. Correction to us, James. Caught on before we get yelled at. All of those abilities cost 1, and the Avengers affiliation bonus can't reduce costs below 1.
That is true.
So Ant-Man and Wasp don't benefit nearly as much from that. They have some strong abilities, like Wasp still has her throw, which gives her a bit of ranged pressure, different than what Ant-Man has for his extreme melee pressure. I think they're still good picks
They're both
because those
threes.
abilities are still really cheap, so they can probably afford them anyway.
Yeah, and they're both threes, so they can both be swapped in and out. Uh,
Yeah.
now
Which one you like is kind of down to your personal preference. I like Ant-Man because I got shellacked by him a couple
yeah,
of times, and
I
I
like Wasp.
respect his damage output.
I like Wasp. She's got the throws. Now we did have a debate on which to bring, and the debate actually did come down also to do we want to bring both? But
Not both. That's
it
too many slots for the
it it,
similar
it did
role.
come down to too many slots for the similar role. We really ended up choosing Ant-Man over Wasp. Now I chose Wasp to begin with because she has a throw. I like having throws in my list, but really it came down to Ant-Man, and Jake is right. We needed the speed. We don't have a lot of people in the list that can just basically just jump across the board. We didn't have a lot of mobility characters at that 3-point level, other than we'll talk about like Miles in a second. But we didn't really have that hard hitting, I can jump across the field and take out something. It kind of came down to Ant-Man being able to do that.
And that rounds out our Avengers members of this roster we put together. We think they all do pretty unique things. There's a little bit of overlap in damage output, like we said, with the Wolverine, Thor, and She-Hulk. But I think that they all kind of have some different perks to them, as well as different tactic cards that work well with them, that they all seem still distinct. Also, sometimes you really just need a beater, and for like a high cost scenario, I could definitely see taking both Thor and Wolverine as a really solid combat team.
Having Thor and Wolverine is definitely going to be that scenario that you're like, I just need to kill stuff. Like stuff just needs to die.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how to deal with either of these scenarios at this moment. Just kill stuff.
She-Hulk, as James mentioned, She-Hulk comes in because we don't have a particular tactic card combination like the Hulk throwing Thor at people strategy. We don't have a particular tactic card, which obviously leads us to a strategy for She-Hulk. I think I like what James originally envisioned, was she's a counterpiece. Is when your opponent brings a high threat investment model, you bring out She-Hulk to try to see if you can get that opening. She-Hulk's defenses and health pool means she'll stick around long enough to probably get delivered. Captain America could use Bodyguard to help make sure she gets delivered to the target. And then She-Hulk can use her own high damage output and her ability to add damage based on the opponent's size, which coincidentally, a lot of these very high threat models do tend to be slightly chunkier. MODOK is a size 3, Thanos is a size 3.
Yep.
And so She-Hulk can pretty quickly get up to a lot of damage output of these valuable models.
So let's talk about Spider-Man, Miles Morales. We kind of
He's the Spider-Man in the black costume.
He's Spider-Man in the black costume. He is basically for there to screw with people's objectives. If you like the mutant extremists, the hammer scenario, Wakanda herbs, anything that people are going to want to hold on to their objective tokens as much as possible. We decided to kind of bring Miles to be able to get across the board and just knock objectives out of their hands.
It's interesting too in that with the cost reduction for Avengers, Miles' web swing only costs 1, and it's another range 3 teleport. Yep. It's really good at cost 1. Even better, it adds 2 dice to his next kick, which is his basic attack that has a size 3 throw built into it if you get a wild. So Miles is another good example of he plays the objectives really well because he can target people carrying lots of objective tokens with his relatively cheap Venom Blast and force them to drop them. Or he can zip around the board and just kick the absolute living crap out of people with his feet
Mm-hmm.
and just throw 6 dice attacks with potential throws to knock them out of position, push them back up the field, and then he can sort of safely retreat using his stealth to get out of the way.
Yeah, and webcrawler is also good. Wallcrawler is good because if you get a scenario that has a lot of terrain, a lot of like just a jumbled mess of stuff on the board, having him just ignoring pretty much all that during movements is a good reason to slot him into that 3-point slot.
The newbie question.
Go for it.
So I noticed that both Captain America and Spider-Man Miles Morales have affiliation special abilities, right?
Yes.
So let's say I could have a list of 6 people, and 3 of them were Web Warriors, and 3 of them were Avengers. Does that mean I get 2? Or do I have to choose at
No.
the beginning of the game?
You got to choose
You have to
the
choose
beginning. Yeah.
Okay.
That's why also, like I said before, She-Hulk, Agent Widow, Okoye, are all
Force.
A-Force. So
A-Force.
yeah, A-Force. So if it was like a low powered and like you like She-Hulk's affiliation for A-Force better than you like Avengers, you could switch to A-Force. Now, not very often I say definitely have 2 affiliations, the ability to have 2 affiliations in your list. It kind of muddies the waters. So it's kind of like a bonus on this list because it just kind of happened that way.
You know, it's just all of a sudden I pulled up Miles Morales' card and I saw that and I went, huh, well, if you had Venom and this other one on here, you could get both in there. And I was like, let me see if that's a rules thing.
Yeah, so you can't have
could.
both.
You can have a very competitive list that does that, but kind of my experience generally dictates I think it's better to be comfortable with a core set of models that you can add
Mhm.
to or expand or swap as needed than it is necessary to be like, and if they play this, I will counter with this list, or I
Yeah.
will play Avengers against, like if they drop Cabal, I'm always playing Avengers. Like, I mean, yeah, you can do that, but
Yeah.
I think it's just more know what you're comfortable playing and then practice it, as
Yeah.
always.
Standard miniature game.
Let's talk about the 2-point slots.
So we have 2 2-point characters to keep things fresh and toasty because we realize that if
You're breaking up.
so with a 14 threat scenario existing in the game, you want to have, we kind of settled on if you had 2 2-point models plus sort of our core of 10 points of Cap, Hawkeye, and Agent Widow, that would give us the flexibility to have 5 models on the table in the 14 threat scenario and be pretty happy with those models and not feel like we took filler just to reach the point cap. Other lists may have an easier time with that because they can use Infinity Gems, which cost 1 threat each, just sort of hit the point number while keeping their overall model count high. But this is how we kind of chose to address that. First off, we brought Toad. Toad, we mentioned in one of our most recent episodes. Toad is a really solid objective manipulator. He has some interesting abilities. You can use him to pass around objective tokens away from the front line. Like, say, Wolverine has dropped someone, and he picked up the token to make sure your opponent didn't get it. Toad can grab it and run away with it. Toad does not have stealth, but he does have some movement abilities that just put him out of easy attack range.
And the reason
plus,
we also,
go ahead, James.
If you look at the extracts that we did, the formula found gives you an extra attack. That it's a pretty powerful attack. And fear, basically the hammer scenario. Within 2, you're still grabbing a hammer from far enough away that he becomes relevant at that. So, really good ways of dealing with stuff. I really like Toad with the formula found, giving him an ungodly attack because a 2-point model was suddenly with like, I think it's like a 5 or 6 dice.
6 dice, beam
3
or something like that. Beam 3.
Yeah,
Still
I think
good.
it's beam 3.
Really good.
Still awesome, especially with Toad's movement abilities. Amazing. Like, that's definitely amazing.
Our other 2-point model that I and spoke up for is Okoye. Because I like Okoye's Okoye doesn't do anything in particular really well, but Okoye has a general mix of abilities that makes her reliable at 2-threat. She has fairly okay defenses in melee. If she can get close enough within range 2 to activate Martial Artist, she gets to count blanks, which helps her quite a bit. She doesn't have any glaring 2 defense weaknesses, so she doesn't have any sort of element attack type disadvantage. She has low health, which is her biggest hindrance for defensively, but she does have Bodyguard, which gives her a way to shunt a hit or a potential big damage threat away from a more valuable piece in your list.
Yep, especially
And if
her.
Okoye, go ahead.
Her and Captain America being say we're gonna say Gamma Wave, because they're really close together. Her and Captain America being around like somebody who's about to get flipped that you don't want flipped, you now have 2 options instead of 1.
Offensively, I think Okoye does actually pretty well for a 2-point model. I think she's probably the most offensive 2-point model there is. Her attacks are not super strong, but she can make a number of them, especially if she gets Flurry on relatively expensive bigger attack. But also just the simple flexibility of having a range 4 0-cost attack means your opponents will often not realize they can get poked by Shuri.
Yeah.
Or by not Shuri, by Okoye. So it gives her the flexibility to always be contributing probably at least 1 attack around, which can add up.
So that's basically this. Let's talk about one thing.
Sorry, I have one more question.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
So when making your list, I see that Black Widow has 2 forms of Black Widow. Can you put in both forms of Black Widow into
Nope.
a list?
Because they're both Natalie Natasha. They're not both Natasha.
More Russian, James.
Sorry. They're both Natasha, so you can only have don't look at the actual code name. Look at their new name.
So
on
actually,
each character card, the big name is the character's sort of famous comic book name, and then the small text is real identity. You cannot have 2 different models with the same secret identity in your list.
Yeah.
Okay, so for example, they brought in Lady Thor, you could have regular Thor and Lady Thor.
Yep.
Unless there's a thing that says later that you can't. Yes.
Yeah, I'm just saying.
So
rules is written now.
Yes.
You could have She-Hulk and Hulk on the same field. There's nothing wrong with that. It's expensive as hell, so you better have a plan. But you could.
Oh yeah, I was just asking. Well, because she
actually
She-Hulk.
12.
There is a tactic card specifically requiring both Hulk and She-Hulk.
God, that has a lot of points.
Someone thought this was. I mean, I think all it does is give them a big throw.
16.
Which
that's 16 with Captain America.
Yeah.
Oh.
But wouldn't that be terrifying?
That'd be
just
so
a bodyguard and 2 20 HP sacks of punching meat.
Just down the field. Oh, that would be horrifying. All right, so
what? Let's talk about tactic cards.
No. Why not Venom?
Why not Venom? Because you have Wolverine and Thor already. Sorry, you don't need that much. Venom has self heals, but Wolverine regenerates.
So we also have that was one of the things. We also had a couple of characters that were on the 10 to 15 points, like the 10 to 15 number, where it was we could probably switch out this person for this person. Wasp was one of them. Venom was one. Taskmaster was another.
The master of tasks.
They were all kind of there as if we take out this person, we could put in this one. That'd be pretty good. But in the end, it didn't quite fit the list. They could fit the list, but it didn't round off the 10 to the point where we wanted it. This list is kind of like the optimized thought planning of how we're going to approach scenarios, and we fit it towards that.
Now, is it going to be necessarily a slam dunk success? No, we're people on YouTube.
Yeah.
I think this would be good fun to play. I think it gives you a lot of options for what you could bring. For example, if there's a crisis that allows you to hold multiple tokens, then you have Miles in your back pocket that you
Mhm.
can bring out for relatively cheap cost. I'd almost, if you think your path to winning is going to be based on controlling objective tokens more than knocking out opponents, I would even swap Agent Widow with Miles.
Yeah.
Because then you can really play for the same cost. It's an easy swap. If you need to go all out for damage, I think you've got the tools on this list to do it with Thor and Wolverine, Cap to back them up with some range attacks as well as Bodyguard. You have a number of characters who can do surprising amounts of damage. Miles with his web swing enhancement, which only costs him 1 power, has a 6 dice attack to generate more power.
Yep.
Ant-Man has a 6 dice attack to generate power. So you can hit surprisingly hard, harder than I think many people would think, by taking some of these 3-point models to augment your sort of core offense.
Yep. So
Okay.
tactic cards wise, we did look at the banned and the restricted list. We took Brace for Impact.
Yep. Brace for Impact is a good standby to mitigate 1 collision damage.
Yep. And then the other one I think was Field Dressing.
Field dressing sounds right. Field dressing lets you recover someone from the dazed condition. It's probably sort of personal preference whether you want med pack or field dressing. I'd recommend one of them. Med pack costs. Field dressing is more expensive and it only heals 1, but it's the only way to take a dazed character and make them not dazed.
Right.
Granted,
It doesn't
there's
help She-Hulk.
complications. One of the biggest complication with field dressing is the fact your opponent gets to activate before you could activate the person you just undazed. So you probably want to make sure you do this at the end of a round.
Yeah.
Very bad idea in most cases to use field dressing relatively early.
The specific ones for combinations, Professionals requires Hawkeye and Agent Widow.
Yep. As we talked about previously, this one lets you hit someone with Hawkeye. It doesn't have to knock them out; it just has to damage them. And then Natasha Romanoff, Agent Widow, can just pick up one of their objective tokens, an asset or civilian token.
And then Thunder Wave.
So it's worth noting that timing of this is going to be a little particular as well because you have to have everything. And then the assumption, it's interesting because this is an active card and says if Clinton Barton damages a character with an attack this round, does not have to be this turn. So you could play this during Black Widow's turn. It's more likely to me you would play it during Hawkeye's turn because that's when you have the most control. Your opponent has the least response time.
Yep, and then she runs away.
Granted, your opponent will get a turn to hit her first and take it back. So again, this might be something you do late in the round once your opponent's heaviest hitters have already gone, or if you can find a way to make it a little safer for Black Widow to run.
I mean, it's she can't spend it on her turn, but basically, combining this with Avengers Assemble, where she can then just move. Now, Avengers Assemble is very unique. Is just for Avengers. So if you're taking like Toad, Okoye, or Spider-Man, they will not benefit from the movement because it is just for the Avengers affiliation.
So yeah, let's talk about that one real quick since we're talking. Avengers Assemble does say any number of allied Avengers characters. So that is why it will not include characters like Toad, Miles Morales, or Okoye, because while they're allied, they are not affiliated.
Mm-hmm.
So some tactics cards
have that word.
Right.
Yes. Okay. Some tactics cards will urge you for having more focused teams than the bare minimum. Avengers Assemble is one of those. It's extremely cheap, and it gives everyone a short advance, which is crazy strong. Avengers Assemble is definitely one of the tactics cards to consider bringing if you're going to play an Avengers team. It's also cool just to shout it at your opponent. Just be like, I ran away, or I closed the distance, or She-Hulk's here now. Deal with it.
Yeah, She-Hulk's here now is kind of like the purpose of Avengers Assemble.
Speaking of, one of the more recent cards that I recommend for a lot of lists, Extreme Conditioning. Yep. When a character starts a move action, they can spend 2 power. If they advance during this move action, they get to use the long movement stick instead of any other movement tool that they would have used normally.
Oh,
so it's only for
She-Hulk's
1 move.
Small.
Yeah, so if Hulk with his small movement is very far away, now Hulk is literally across the board during Hulk's turn, so your opponent has no time to react. Or even for just something simple like a character is pushed out of position and you need them to get back there, or you would very much like for this objective holder to not be there anymore.
Yep.
Extreme conditioning is a relatively generic effect, but I think that's part of why it's so strong. Is there's no weird conditions, there's no prerequisites. It is a generically useful card that you'll come up with a good use for it in pretty much every.
Yeah. So also, we have acute senses, which is basically you can just remove stealth uh, when targeting somebody,
Also, you can ignore line of sight, which could
which
be
is also
really
good.
important when your opponent is behind cover.
Hmm.
Sorry, it doesn't actually ignore cover, but if your opponent is behind a building or would otherwise not be able to be shot, you can use acute senses for the relatively cheap cost to be like, no, I'm really coming for you this time.
Yeah. And then we have Mark for Death, which is just a really good kind of like a screw you to somebody, especially if they're like a objective runner or if you know they're going to try to run away, because it reduces them to it removes stealth, and it also drops them down to a short, and they can't modify dice, so
Defense
it's
dice specifically.
defense dice. So it's just a really good all around card of just, especially when you're coming down to somebody who's once again, She Hulk's like that person needs to die. Mark for Death is a good one to throw on them.
And I think we talked about it, mentioned it in passing already, but talk about Thunderwave real quick. If you have a mission with both Thor and Captain America, you can take Thunderwave, which I
Ken,
misspoke earlier. It's not an area, it's a beam attack. It is a beam 5, 6 dice attack that costs both of them 2, and they have to be within 1 of each other. But
take it.
it's a really solid high damage attack, depending on how positioning works out. It has to be used during Thor's turn, and the beam is drawn from Captain America, so you kind of need to plan this one out in advance. But if Captain America's on a point, uh, Thor can always use his charge ability to close the distance,
Hmm.
hit someone in front of Cap, and then with his second action, use this card to do the beam attack and try to hit as much as he can.
Yeah, yeah. Especially like Gamma Wave. I would actually bring Thor and Cap on Gamma Wave because Gamma Wave is a solid straight line right in the middle, and most people are kind of clumped around them so they don't take damage. Even though it's only a single point of damage, for some reason people think that you have to just clump around them. Um, Having Thunder Wave is just going to hit tons of people. It's a good combination.
And maybe even if it's not necessarily like competitive optimal, take one of these combination attacks. It's fun.
They're fun.
Play games.
Yeah.
I like
So
it more than I like it more than Iron Man combination.
yeah, because it's Iron Man. So that's our Avengers list.
Finally,
Oh,
scenarios.
oh yeah, yeah.
Crisis.
We
Because we
talked
talked
about it a
about it
little.
quite a bit. So Crisis is interesting because you can never guarantee what scenario you're going to play.
Mm-hmm.
You can choose 3 of each type, and then you'll discard one of them at random and pick one of the remainder. So it is a bad idea in a general sense to plan your entire roster around one specific scenario
Yes.
because that'll 100% either you won't get to pick that color or that'll be the one that gets discarded. So you kind of need to be flexible with these, but you can kind of focus in as more crises and scenarios become available. It's important probably to note what shapes their tokens lie down in. If you can get multiple crises with the same sort of placement shape, then you can practice games on like a predefined pattern
Mm-hmm.
of how much movement do I need to get between these stationary objectives? How difficult is it to grab 2 or 3 extraction crises objectives on turn 1? Then you can kind of practice your openings that way.
Yeah. Am I going to be worried about if I'm, if I'm within 2 of an objective, do I'm taking damage, kind of like with Mutant Madman, um, or am I going to have to worry about flipping a token and it not being the token that I want? Um, you know, Thinking about these kind of things of just, you know, there's a couple of scenarios where it's just like flip over the token. It might be what you're looking for, like the Creeth one. Um, Having that variability is always good for your opponent and not you. You want to know exactly what's going on your side. Um, that's why like the formula found is a good one because especially like with Toad, it gives an extra attack that you would normally wouldn't have. So your 2-point characters might become really powerful at some point. Having Captain America have a beam 3, 6 dice attack, 5 dice attack, that's awesome. Um, having forcing people off of having throws, having like She-Hulk on Gamma Wave, where she just throws people off of the points where they can't get back now and they're taking extra damage. Uh, Thinking about these kind of things is a good way for you to set up your mindset on how you want your list built, but at the same time, think about what they brought as an objective and kind of go, okay, cool. Am I going to be able to counter this? Am I going to play to one objective? Or am I playing to both objectives? So there's a lot of different things to think about on your list building portion of this.
Or acknowledge that scenarios are crazy random and so much variability, and just do your best to practice.
Or play
Like you can absolutely plan
Blackwater,
for scenarios.
or play
Yeah.
Blackwater and just kill everyone.
No, Blackwater, even Blackwater can't ignore objectives. The other big thing to mention is scenarios dictate how much threat you have to build a given list. So if you want to be playing higher threat games where you can bring more models or bring more expensive models, then you also need to bring higher threat crises. Still not going to guarantee anything because the person who wins the dice roll at the beginning of the game gets to choose the threat level. But if you only have high threat cards, then he may choose yours.
Yep.
In this case, we are playing 18, 17, 15, and 14 in ours. So I would make sure that you have a plan for what you would bring, both if your scenario gets picked for threat level, but just in general, be prepared for those point levels.
Yep. Yep. All right. So that is pretty much our Avengers list. One that we both sat down, took a basic just idea and started building off of it. It's always good to bounce your ideas of lists off somebody else and have them just not look at it and go, yeah, it looks good, and toss it back to you, but ask questions like, why are you bringing Venom if you have Wolverine and Thor in your list? Hey, where's your 14-point list on this? Because you don't have a lot of 2-point characters. Uh, okay, cool. Why are you bringing Nebula? Questions that should be asked for your list. Just don't.
Have you heard about extreme conditioning? You should take extreme conditioning.
Yeah. Hey, you shouldn't be bringing drop off. It's not allowed in competitions anymore.
I would just straight up argue it's not allowed. Throw that card out.
Yeah. All right. Thank you for guys for watching. We will probably do this again for another list. And yeah. So we'll see you guys next week.
Everyone take care.
Game off.
Game off.